On the evening of May 7, 1945, within a requisitioned German estate on the outskirts of Frankfurt, two men who had just helped rescue civilization sat across from each other at an elaborate desk. Beyond the walls, American troops were celebrating, drinking freely, discharging their weapons skyward in unbridled joy. Germany had at last capitulated. The European conflict, the horror that had devoured an entire continent, had officially concluded. Inside that silent chamber, George S. Patton was not joining the festivities. He examined the features of the man opposite him, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, the celebrated mastermind behind Allied triumph in Europe. Patton had not arrived to savor their success. He had come to deliver a warning he understood Eisenhower would reject, words that would fracture their bond, terminate his own military future, and later be characterized by officials and journalists as insanity. "We will be forced to battle them eventually," Patton declared, his tone measured. "Let us engage them now, while our forces remain whole and victory is achievable." He was not referring to the Germans. Their empire lay shattered. He was speaking of the Soviet Union. For a moment, Eisenhower merely stared at him. For 3 years, he had meticulously preserved an alliance with Joseph Stalin's government, managing egos, philosophies, and strategic requirements to vanquish Adolf Hitler. In American publications, Stalin appeared as Uncle Joe, the rough but endearing companion in triumph. Newsreels celebrated the Red Army as heroic freedom fighters. Children gathered scrap metal and cheered for their Soviet friends. And here sat Patton, the most ferocious of America's commanders, calmly proposing that the United States redirect its weapons toward that partner immediately, before the smoke of victory had even cleared. "George, you fail to grasp politics," Eisenhower responded at last. "The conflict has ended. We are returning home." In that instant, Patton perceived something that unsettled him more than any combat zone. Eisenhower comprehended precisely what he was suggesting. At some level, Ike recognized that Patton's evaluation of the Soviet menace held validity, yet he also understood he would never act upon it. The political consequences were insurmountable. What ensued was among the most consequential silences in American military annals. A window of possibility, if it existed whatsoever, shut quietly without a single bullet fired. Patton had reached his conclusion not from theoretical speculation, but from what his Third Army had witnessed firsthand as it penetrated deeper into Central Europe than any other Allied contingent. His armor had swept across Germany into Czechoslovakia and pressed against the ambiguous, shifting boundary separating Western forces from Soviet territory. Wherever he traveled, he encountered something that troubled him far more than the shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht. He observed the Red Army. Patton's staff and intelligence units reported scenes that alarmed even veterans hardened by years of warfare. Soviet soldiers were not conducting themselves like temporary liberators. They were behaving like conquerors who intended to remain. Reports arrived describing systematic plundering, villages stripped of machinery and livestock, trains loaded with stolen equipment rolling eastward. There were accounts of widespread sexual violence, savage retribution, and immediate executions of civilians suspected of anti-communist sentiments. Entire populations were being displaced and transported toward Soviet forced labor facilities. Patton did not idealize warfare. He was intimately familiar with brutality. But what he witnessed in Eastern Europe persuaded him that the Soviet Union was not a collaborator in a new democratic framework. It was a totalitarian dominion extending its boundaries westward. In April of 1945, he wrote to his wife Beatrice with typical directness. He confessed that he harbored no wish to comprehend the Russians in any emotional manner, only to estimate how much firepower would be required to eliminate them if circumstances demanded. They conveyed to him, he wrote, the impression of a power that must be dreaded in any future reorganization of global influence. While American diplomats in Washington still anticipated that Stalin would honor commitments of democratic elections and national sovereignty, Patton was watching those assurances dissolve before his eyes. He encountered American prisoners of war who had fallen into Soviet custody near the conflict's end. Their testimonies disturbed him more than German imprisonment ever had. They described having their timepieces, footwear, and provisions stolen. Officers who objected were beaten or killed. They recounted conditions so dreadful that some declared they preferred their former German captors to their new Soviet liberators. The pattern persisted. Soviet units disassembled German factories component by component, loading entire manufacturing facilities onto rail cars to be transported east. In Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, Soviet-supported communists were infiltrating government offices, police headquarters, and judicial systems. Resistance fighters who had endangered their lives opposing Nazi rule were now being detained, interrogated, and frequently executed, not by the Gestapo, but by Soviet intelligence operatives. By the time Germany surrendered, Patton's concerns had crystallized into a precise, calculated assessment. What he proposed to Eisenhower, and subsequently to senior officials in Washington, was not the eruption of a frustrated soldier unwilling to accept peace. It was a strategic blueprint constructed from intelligence reports, battlefield observations, and an unsparing analysis of Soviet capabilities and vulnerabilities. His reasoning was merciless and straightforward. The Soviet Union had paid a catastrophic price to defeat Germany. Approximately 27 million of its citizens were dead. The Red Army, though enormous, had been drained of blood. Its divisions in Eastern Europe were extended far from their supply foundations, surviving on captured depots, requisitioned food, and whatever they could extract from conquered territories. Their logistical chains stretched back thousands of miles to a nation devastated by combat. American forces, in contrast, stood at the zenith of their might. They possessed overwhelming aerial superiority. Their supply routes ran back across France to Atlantic harbors, sustained by an industrial apparatus untouched by enemy bombardment. American divisions were fully supplied, properly nourished, and supported by fleets of aircraft that could, in Patton's estimation, devastate Soviet transportation and communication centers at will. To Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson, Patton summarized his evaluation in stark language that same month of May 1945. "We could overcome the Russians in 6 weeks." The Soviet Union, he contended, possessed no genuine strategic bombing capacity. Its anti-aircraft systems were limited. American air power alone could shred Soviet logistics. On the battlefield, Soviet tank manufacturing was impressive in volume, but after years of uninterrupted combat, their armored formations were depleted and mechanically unreliable. American M4 Sherman tanks might not be as heavily protected as certain German or Soviet variants, but they were dependable, and vast quantities of them stood ready for action. Most significant to Patton was the human element. Soviet soldiers had fought with savagery to protect their homeland, but now they were being ordered to occupy nations that were not theirs, controlling populations that did not welcome them. Many of these troops, he believed, possessed little enthusiasm for permanent garrisons in foreign lands. If an American offensive pushed eastward, Patton predicted that morale within the Red Army would fracture. He was convinced that numerous Soviet soldiers would surrender, desert, or simply refuse to engage. Then came the most inflammatory component of his proposal. "We can equip the Germans," Patton suggested. Across Europe, hundreds of thousands of former Wehrmacht soldiers languished in prisoner-of-war camps, facing uncertain destinies. Many despised and feared the Russians far more than they resented the Americans or British. In Patton's view, those men could be re-equipped, reorganized under new officers, and deployed against the Soviets. "I would sooner have a German division beside me than a Soviet one," he wrote. To the political leadership in Washington, this recommendation was appalling. The United States had just sacrificed enormous wealth and blood to defeat Nazi Germany. To arm German troops again, even under Allied direction, felt like a betrayal of everything the war had represented. Yet Patton's logic followed a ruthless trajectory. If the Soviets constituted the next threat, why not employ the adversaries of that adversary, however recently vanquished, to blunt their advance? Within weeks, certain of Patton's statements were leaked to journalists. The portrait painted was not of a clear-eyed strategist making a grim calculation, but of a reckless militarist who had overstepped, someone sympathetic to Germans and obsessed with igniting another war. Eisenhower possessed reasons to reject Patton's scheme that extended beyond fear of headlines. The American public yearned desperately to bring their sons home. Congress was already demanding rapid demobilization and cautioning against new entanglements in Europe. Logistically, American forces had been positioned to occupy Germany, not to advance deeper into Poland and beyond. Supply lines would require reorganization at tremendous expense. But beneath these practical obstacles lay a more decisive barrier: politics. Harry Truman had only recently assumed the presidency following Franklin Roosevelt's death. He was still adapting to the role, still surrounded by many of Roosevelt's counselors, and still committed publicly to a policy of cooperation with Stalin. At Yalta, the Allies had agreed upon a framework for post-war Europe that formalized spheres of influence and guaranteed free elections in liberated nations. To propose attacking the Soviet Union in that context would have been perceived as destroying solemn commitments. Eisenhower understood this. If he presented a plan resembling Patton's to the president, he would be branded a warmonger, a man who sought to ignite a new global conflict just as the previous one concluded. The press would assault him relentlessly. Congress would turn against him. His reputation as the calm, steady architect of victory would be demolished. He also genuinely believed that diplomacy offered a path forward. Like many leaders of that era, Eisenhower hoped that once the wartime emergency passed, the Soviet Union would moderate, that tensions would diminish, and that the newly established United Nations could serve as a forum to manage disputes. He thought in terms of institutions, treaties, and political processes. Patton thought in terms of opportunity and force. "George perceives the world as a battlefield," Eisenhower told his chief of staff. "He does not comprehend that we must coexist with these people." In this disagreement, Patton was not entirely isolated. Across the English Channel, Winston Churchill was arriving at similar conclusions. Churchill had distrusted Bolshevism from the moment of the Russian Revolution in 1917. He had only aligned with the Soviets out of necessity to defeat the greater immediate evil of Hitler. Even as the war wound down, he warned that Soviet ambitions did not conclude with expelling the Nazis. By April of 1945, Churchill was dispatching increasingly urgent messages to Truman and Eisenhower. He implored them to push Western forces as far east as possible before the Red Army consolidated its hold. He wanted Americans and British troops, not Soviet ones, entering cities like Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. On May 12, 1945, Churchill employed a phrase that would soon become legendary. "An iron curtain," he wrote to Truman, "has descended upon their front." Behind that barrier, he warned, no one truly understood what was occurring, but he suspected that liberty was being strangled. That same month, Churchill instructed his military planners to draft a daring and disturbing concept: Operation Unthinkable. It was essentially an Allied offensive designed to drive Soviet forces from Poland and Eastern Europe, employing rearmed German units alongside British and American divisions. The British chiefs of staff analyzed the idea. Their conclusion was sobering but not dismissive. Under appropriate conditions, and if launched immediately, they believed such an operation was militarily viable. It would be costly and demand full commitment, but it might succeed in forcing the Red Army backward. Churchill forwarded the plan to Truman. The American president barely hesitated before declining it. The notion of attacking the Soviet Union, particularly with German soldiers fighting under Allied command, repulsed him. The political and moral ramifications were too enormous to contemplate. When Patton discovered that Churchill had entertained essentially the identical strategy he himself had advocated, he felt a bitter sense of vindication. "At least one man in authority comprehends what we confront," he told his staff. Within months, Churchill's fears began materializing. Soviet control over Eastern Europe solidified. Promised elections were postponed, manipulated, or cancelled entirely. Opposition leaders vanished into prisons or graves. Communist parties backed by Soviet security agencies seized control of police forces, bureaucracies, and media outlets. Back in the United States, the manner in which journalists discussed Patton shifted dramatically. During the war, he had been portrayed as a colorful, if controversial, hero, the flamboyant tank commander whose profanity-laden speeches motivated troops and terrified Germans. In May and June of 1945, however, the tone transformed. Journalists seized upon his harsh comments regarding the Soviets and his suggestion of rearming German units. Columnist Drew Pearson described Patton's statements as deeply troubling, suggesting that the general's judgment might be deteriorating. At a moment when the nation longed for peace, Pearson insisted Patton seemed intent on courting another catastrophic conflict. Editorials in respected newspapers argued that his remarks demonstrated a dangerous ignorance of diplomatic reality. Magazines speculated openly whether this brilliant battlefield commander was simply incapable of adapting to peacetime. None of these publications seriously investigated the reports his intelligence teams were transmitting from Eastern Europe. They did not explore Soviet atrocities or the systematic installation of puppet governments. The narrative hardened. Patton was a superb warrior, but also an unstable relic of combat, unsuited to the new era. Pressure on Eisenhower intensified. By August of 1945, officials in Washington were making it clear that Patton's public criticisms were unacceptable. The catalyst came from an entirely different policy debate: denazification. At a press conference, Patton was questioned about efforts to purge all former Nazi Party members from positions in the German administration. He responded with characteristic bluntness. Many of these individuals, he argued, had joined the party for practical reasons, not from ideological conviction. To remove them all from office was, in his words, idiotic. He compared the situation to an American political contest, saying that belonging to the Nazi Party in Germany was often no more serious than being a Democrat or a Republican at home. The remark was explosive, reported without context. It made it sound as if Patton was equating participation in a murderous totalitarian movement with membership in a mainstream American political party. Headlines accused him of trivializing Nazi crimes. Politicians denounced him. The controversy provided Eisenhower the justification he needed. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. Officially, the reason was his inappropriate comments about denazification. Unofficially, everyone in Patton's circle understood that his relentless warnings about the Soviets had played an equally significant role. Stripped of operational command, Patton spent his final months in Europe doing what he could: observing, writing, and warning. His letters from October and November 1945 read like a combination of military analysis and prophecy. He urged American leaders to maintain a posture of strength, to keep their boots polished and bayonets sharpened, and to present the Red Army and Syrie an unmistakable image of power. This, he insisted, was the only language Moscow truly understood. If the United States disarmed and relaxed, he warned, victory over Germany would prove hollow. They might have defeated one enemy only to surrender the field to another. In early December of that year, Patton met again with Undersecretary Patterson. He presented his bleak forecast. The Soviets, he said, would not withdraw from Eastern Europe. They would transform temporary occupation into permanent dominion. They would spread communism through Western Europe by subversion, intimidation, and, when necessary, violence. Eventually, the United States would be drawn into military confrontation with them. "We will fight them eventually," he repeated. "In 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, we will wish we had done it in 1945 when we possessed the opportunity." Patterson listened courteously. Then he delivered the same answer Eisenhower had, in a more bureaucratic form. Washington had no appetite for confrontation. The American public wanted peace, not another crusade. Whatever Patton observed on the ground, his proposed response was politically impossible. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was involved in a collision near Mannheim. A truck suddenly turned in front of his vehicle. The general was thrown forward, suffering a severe neck injury that left him paralyzed from the shoulders down. Other passengers in the car escaped with minor wounds. Patton, the man who had survived countless dangers at the front, was mortally wounded in what appeared to be an ordinary traffic accident. He lingered in a hospital bed for nearly 2 weeks, unable to move. On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died at the age of 60. The timing of the accident and the strange circumstances surrounding it fueled rumor and speculation almost immediately. Some pointed to the driver's peculiar explanations. Others noted the coincidence that the one general most outspoken about the Soviet threat had been silenced days after making a final dire prediction to Washington. But no credible evidence of assassination has ever surfaced. The more sober conclusion is that it was a tragic accident, one that nevertheless removed from the stage the loudest voice demanding a confrontation with Moscow at its most vulnerable. In the years that followed, events unfolded in a pattern that eerily echoed Patton's warnings. By 1946, Soviet power in Eastern Europe was entrenched. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all fell under communist control. The free elections promised at Yalta proved to be an illusion. In Poland, resistance leaders who had fought the Nazis for 6 years were arrested, tried on fabricated charges, and either executed or sent to labor camps deep inside the Soviet Union. In Czechoslovakia, a communist coup in 1948 overthrew the democratic government. That same year, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk died in a mysterious fall from a window. Officially ruled a suicide, but widely suspected to be murder. The pattern repeated from country to country. Soviet presence was followed by the installation of communist governments, the suppression of opposition parties, the nationalization of property, and the creation of secret police forces loyal to Moscow. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the wider Soviet bloc killed roughly 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or subjected to everyday repression. The Iron Curtain that Churchill had envisioned became a literal border of barbed wire, concrete walls, and watchtowers. The Cold War that Patton had wanted to preempt lasted for approximately 45 years. It cost trillions of dollars in arms spending and claimed millions of lives in proxy conflicts from Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan to Angola. By 1949, the Soviet Union had detonated its own atomic bomb, ending America's nuclear monopoly and ushering in an age of mutual annihilation. By 1950, confronted with North Korean aggression backed by Moscow and Beijing, the United States found itself in precisely the sort of military clash with communist forces that Patton had predicted, except now under far more dangerous conditions. Patton's argument had never been that war with the Soviets could be avoided altogether. His claim was that the moment of surrender in 1945 was the least dangerous time to confront them militarily. The Red Army was exhausted. Soviet industry was shattered. American power was at its peak. If the showdown was inevitable, he believed, better to face it then than to wait for the Soviets to regroup, rearm, and acquire nuclear weapons. Whether his military assessment was entirely correct remains a matter of debate among historians and strategists. What is far less debatable is that the broad outline of his warnings was borne out by subsequent events. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe did become effectively permanent until the late 1980s. Communist expansion did spread globally. Military confrontation with communist forces did occur repeatedly at high cost. By 1947, even many liberals who had supported Roosevelt's more hopeful approach to Moscow had to acknowledge that something fundamental had gone wrong. George Kennan's famous long telegram from Moscow described the Soviet regime as inherently expansionist and ideologically committed to undermining the West, language that, in a more measured tone, closely mirrored Patton's visceral warnings from 1945. The Truman Doctrine, announced that same year, committed the United States to a policy of containing Soviet influence wherever it began to spread. Yet containment came with its own tragic trade-offs. It accepted Soviet control over Eastern Europe as a grim fait accompli, drawing the line further west. It meant fighting limited wars in Asia instead of risking a general conflict in Europe. It meant living for decades under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. Conservative critics would later seize on Patton as a prophetic figure, a man who had seen what others refused to see. General Douglas MacArthur, who would clash with Truman over strategy in the Korean War, wrote that Patton understood the nature of communism and knew that it had to be confronted militarily. His removal, MacArthur argued, was a tragedy with long-term consequences. Decades later, Ronald Reagan invoked Patton's warnings as he argued that the United States must adopt a stance of strength and moral clarity toward what he called the evil empire. When the Berlin Wall crumbled in 1989, and when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, some conservatives pointed back to Patton's May 1945 conversation with Eisenhower. Reagan's policy of military buildup and confrontation, they argued, validated Patton's instincts. If the Soviet system could ultimately be broken by pressure, then perhaps in some alternate history where Patton's advice had been heeded, Eastern Europe might have been freed 45 years earlier. But the question of whether Patton's proposed offensive would have succeeded is ultimately unanswerable. The political reality of 1945 made his plan almost unimaginable for democratic leaders. Regardless of its military chances, the United States and Britain were weary, their people desperate for peace. They had just emerged from a cataclysm whose horrors were still being uncovered in the death camps. To ask those societies to launch another war immediately, this time against a recent ally, was asking for something they were almost certainly incapable of providing. Patton's tragedy, then, was not simply that he was right. It was that he may have been right at a moment when his country could not act on that truth. His story poses questions that have not vanished. When should the United States confront an emerging threat militarily, rather than relying on diplomacy and hope? How far should generals go in advocating for strategies that are militarily sound but politically impossible? When do political leaders have a duty to ignore public opinion and act preemptively? And when does such action become recklessness? Similar debates echoed after the attacks of September 11th, when policymakers argued over whether to use preemptive force against terrorist networks and their state sponsors. They echo again as America grapples with the rise of China and the expansion of its influence. Do you confront a rival power early while the balance of strength favors you? Or do you wait, hope that engagement and negotiation will moderate their ambitions? Patton represents one pole of that argument, the warrior who believes threats should be crushed while they are still vulnerable. Eisenhower in 1945 represented the other, the coalition builder who believes in diplomacy, institutions, and the slow grinding of politics. In that sense, Eisenhower's handling of Patton can be read in two very different ways. On one interpretation, the system worked as designed. A general who refused to accept civilian guidance was relieved. Military power remained subordinate to elected authority. On another interpretation, the system failed. A general who had correctly identified a looming strategic danger was sidelined because his warnings were inconvenient and uncomfortable. Eisenhower himself would later acknowledge that he and others underestimated the nature of the Soviet threat in those early post-war years, but he never conceded that Patton's suggestion of immediate military action against Moscow had been either wise or feasible. From his perspective, the politics, the morale of his troops, and the balance of obligations all made such a move irresponsible. Patton did not care about political feasibility. He cared about defeating what he saw as America's next enemy before that enemy grew stronger. That was the lens through which he viewed history, war, and his own duty. He died on December 21, 1945, in a hospital bed in Germany, paralyzed, far from the front lines he loved. At his request, he was buried not in a grand national cemetery in the United States, but among the soldiers of the Third Army in Luxembourg, the men with whom he had fought and bled. In death, Patton became larger than life, a symbol onto which different groups projected their own beliefs. To many conservatives, he embodied the clarity and courage to name evil and advocate force when necessary. To many liberals, he symbolized the dark side of militarism, the man who too easily reached for war as a solution. To most of the public, he remained the fiery tank commander who had helped break Hitler's grip on Europe. The question of whether he was right about the Soviet Union was answered not by arguments, but by events. Permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe for decades, global communist expansion, and a Cold War that reshaped world politics until the end of the 20th century. Whether his chosen remedy would have prevented that history or plunged the world into something worse, we will never know. What we do know is that George S. Patton saw, in the spring of 1945, a danger that others preferred not to face. He spoke about it bluntly, refused to be silenced, and paid for that refusal with his career and possibly with his life. The leaders who dismissed his warnings spent the next 45 years struggling to manage the consequences of the reality he had tried to confront. His voice still echoes, a reminder that there are moments when the person who sees most clearly is also the one most easily labeled dangerous, unhinged, or extreme. Sometimes the prophet is pushed aside, the truth-teller is silenced, and the warrior who insists on naming the next enemy is removed by politicians who would rather enjoy victory than face the next storm gathering beyond the horizon. History has rendered its verdict on the events of 1945, though the lessons remain contested. The millions who suffered behind the Iron Curtain, the dissidents who rotted in gulags, the families torn apart by secret police, the nations whose sovereignty was crushed beneath Soviet tanks, paid the price for decisions made in that Frankfurt mansion and in the corridors of Washington. Patton understood something that comfortable men in safe offices often forget: that peace purchased through weakness is merely a pause between wars, and that the enemy you refuse to confront today will only grow stronger tomorrow. His methods were harsh, his personality abrasive, his solutions extreme. But his diagnosis of the Soviet threat proved devastatingly accurate. The general who warned that we would fight them eventually was proven correct by history itself. The only question that remains, the question that haunts strategic thinkers to this day, is whether the price of waiting was higher than the cost of acting would have been. George S. Patton lies buried in Luxembourg, surrounded by the soldiers who followed him across Europe. His gravestone is simple, identical to those around it, just as he requested. But his legacy towers over that quiet cemetery, a monument to the costs of ignored warnings and the terrible patience of gathering threats. The storm he foresaw arrived exactly as he predicted. Whether it could have been stopped in 1945, we will never know. What we know is that he tried to stop it, and for that effort, he was silenced. Some truths are too dangerous to speak. Some warnings come too early to be heard. And some warriors see too clearly for their own good.